Hamas.
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 Hamas. Hamas.
Israel.
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 Israel's
For Palestinians.
Palestine.
Gaza.
Gaza.
The Palestinian
Gaza.
War.
War. The war.
War. The war.
War. War.
war.
War. Conflict.
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 Fentanyl.
Israel says.
Dozen.
What's going on? I mean, we've been hearing about it for months now. Hamas, Israel, Palestine, war, conflict, genocide. It's unavoidable. But what does it all mean? If you haven't been watching the news, and you haven't been on social media, or you haven't left your room in the past 8 months, you probably don't know what a lot of these terms mean or what a lot of these places are. But how many people really do? Let's find out.
What do you know about the Palestine and Israel conflict?
I honestly don't know a lot.
That it's gotten super popular recently.
Honestly, not too much.
I'm not super knowledgeable, but I feel like I do have a decent amount of knowledge.
Probably not as much as I should.
Honestly, I don't know as much as I probably should know.
I know that the state of Israel has been conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Palestinian people for as long as the inception of the current state of Israel back in 1948.
I know that anybody who supports Israel needs to either get educated or shut up.
Not that much.
Not much.
People in Gaza are being tormented and bombed by Israel.
Well, I do know that there was a terrorist group in Palestine called Hamas that attacked Israel, and Israel obviously is seeking some revenge against the terror group, and in doing so they are killing a lot of civilians, and this is dragging out for quite some time.
Like, what's your stance on it, or where do you think that you would fall?
Pro-Palestine.
I don't know. I don't know too much about it.
I don't think anyone deserves to die. Personally, I would love to see a ceasefire. I would love to see the fighting stop.
I fully support Palestine.
My stance is that Israel should stop invading Gaza.
I support Palestine with as much as I know.
Pro-Palestine, of course. I think that anybody who is anti-Palestine and supports Israel inherently supports genocide, and anybody who says otherwise is simply wrong.
I am for the dissolution of the apartheid regime.
Like, I'm pro-Palestine.
I am pro-Palestine. To simplify myself, is that no matter what stance you have, dead babies are bad.
Where did you get your news from so far?
As bad as it sounds, online.
Twitter, social media.
On social media.
Social media and my parents. I think the most I've gone is TikTok or Google.
The internet, a lot of YouTube news shows, but I try to check sources before I go to purport any of this information.
Like TikTok, obviously, but then, you see some things in like CBC, things like that.
Generally, not social media. I use, trusted news sources. I use a variety. I don't just use one outlet, but several online sources.
From a combination of videos on TikTok and Instagram. Instagram, you can't have actual news companies on both Facebook and Instagram. So it's essentially people who have made it their job to do that. TikTok.
Just on CBC at 5 when I'm eating supper.
I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home.
Out of the 15 people interviewed, only 4 knew more about the conflict than the fact that it's a conflict and Palestinians are dying. Out of the additional 40 plus people we asked to interview, a majority of them stated that they didn't want to be interviewed due to the fact that they didn't know enough about it. I mean, it is difficult to find a news source that covers the history, the timeline of the past 8 months, as well as the stories of real people in the conflict. But still, it's a bit jarring to see how many people don't know about it. Out of the people we interviewed, most of them could agree on one thing, that this conflict is a bloody one. But how did we get here? Let me give you a rundown of the history. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, a new movement arose to national and international attention: Zionism, the call for the creation of a Jewish homeland, particularly in Palestine. Arthur Balfour, Britain's foreign secretary at the time, wrote a single 67-word letter that committed the British government to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. In simpler terms, a European power promised the Zionist movement a country where 90% of inhabitants were Arab Muslims, not Jewish people. Following this movement came the mass immigration of an estimated 376,415 Jewish people. Many of these people were fleeing Nazism in Europe. So, what followed? Well, what many would claim to be many conflicts is what followed. The truth is, an impossible number of violence, conflict, and government interventions came, a number I cannot possibly thoroughly explore if I wish to cover as much as I hope to do so. So I will be giving a highly condensed version of the main parts of the conflict. The first of many violences is considered to be the Arab Revolt. In April of 1936, a newly formed Arab National Committee called for a strike, which included the withholding of tax payments and the boycotting of Jewish products in protest of Jewish immigration and British colonialism. This was faced by a mass arrest campaign and punitive home demolition by the British. By the end of 1939, more than 20,000 British troops had been sent to Palestine. Villages were bombed by air, homes were demolished, curfews were imposed, and administrative detentions and killings were not uncommon. In 3 years, 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 to 20,000 were injured, and 5,600 were imprisoned. The UN then proposed Resolution 181, or the UN Partition Plan, which partitioned Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. This was rejected by Palestine due to the fact that this plan would allot 55% of historical Palestine to a Jewish state, including the coast, their most fertile land. In 1947, before Israel was even declared a state, Zionist paramilitaries embarked on a military operation to destroy Palestinian towns and villages to expand the borders of the soon-to-be Zionist state. From 1947 to 1949, more than 500 Palestinian villages, towns, and cities were destroyed. At least 15,000 Palestinians were killed, an estimated 750,000 Palestinians forced to flee or being driven from their homes, and the Zionists managed to capture 78% of historic Palestine, the remaining 22% becoming what is now known as the Gaza Strip and West Bank. This has come to be known as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. In December 1948, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194. This stated that Palestinians should be permitted to return to their homes and be compensated for any lost or destroyed property. Despite this, none were allowed to return. Israel was then admitted into the UN May of 1949, and a Palestine state was not created. Palestine would remain under military rule, continuing to be expelled from their homes as more Israeli settlements were built in old Palestinian villages and towns. Old Palestine town names, and the name itself Palestine, were removed from books and maps. In 1967, Israel would occupy the rest of historic Palestine, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being driven from the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. This has been named the Nakba, or the setback period. In December of 1987, the first Intifada, which is Arabic for revolution, began. Protests began to spread throughout Gaza and into the West Bank, with Palestinians throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers and tanks. The Hamas movement was established as a result, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which engaged in armed resistance against the occupation. The Israeli Defense Force responded with summary killings, closures of universities, deportation of activists, and the destruction of homes. 1,070 Palestinians were killed, 236 being children. more than 175,000 Palestinians were arrested. The Second Intifada came in 2000, causing severe destruction to Palestinian infrastructure and their economy, as well as the reoccupation of many Palestinian-governed areas. In 2005, the Intifada would end, and 9,000 Israeli soldiers left their enclaves within the Gaza Strip. A year later, Hamas wins the legislative election. Gaza is put under a 16-year blockade, deepening their humanitarian crisis as the West Bank is put under Israel military administration. 2008, 1,110 Palestinians are killed. 13 Israelis are killed. 2012, 150 Palestinians are killed. 6 Israelis are killed. Summer of 2014, 2,200 Palestinians are killed. 73 Israelis are killed. December 2017, the Trump administration recognizes Jerusalem, a previously shared territory between Israel and Palestine, as Israel's capital. 2021, more than 200 Palestinians are killed. At least 10 Israelis are killed. 2022, 146 Palestinians are killed. 29 Israelis are killed. October of 2023, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, declares war on Hamas. I've said a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics and lists, but it's important to look at this through the perspective of a person, not of a historian. Each and every death toll mentioned, each and every conflict and event talked about are things that real living people went through. The numbers are real people who had families and lives and friends and ambitions and love. This entire situation is one that needs to be looked at through a lens of empathy. Now, the past 8 months have been brutal and bloody, the violence impossible to hear about, but something that we need to hear. Since October 7th, 36,615 Palestinians and 1,139 Israelis have been killed. Over 100 journalists have been killed. In Palestine, over 15,000 of those deaths are children. Over 86,136 Palestinians have been injured, and over 10,000 are missing. In Israel, at least 8,730 people have been injured. More than half of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, whether by bombings or punitive demolition, gunfire, or other causes. 80% of commercial facilities have been damaged or destroyed, this including restaurants, shops, gas stations. 267 places of worship have been destroyed. 15 out of 35 hospitals partially function. 83% of groundwater wells are not operational. 85.8% of schools have been destroyed or damaged. No matter what your perspective on this all is, you cannot tell me that out of the 36,615 deaths in Palestine, more than half of which were women and children, that they were all Hamas. You can't say that 85.8% of the schools or 20 of the hospitals in Palestine were Hamas headquarters. No matter what stance you or I take on this conflict, 15,000 dead children is an atrocious number. This issue is no longer political when we get to this point. It is an issue amongst humans, and something that is not ignorable any longer. So we see what's happening in Palestine and Israel, and we know what Palestinians want, just freedom. But what have we been doing in Canada and the US? What do Americans think? Well, the US government has had close ties with Israel for years. Since October 7th, the Biden administration has reportedly made over 100 military aid transfers to Israel, although only 2 of them have been made public. At the time I'm filming this, the Biden administration is pushing to send $1 billion in military aid to Israel. The aid that has been sent so far consists of tanks, artillery, ammo, bombs, rockets, and small arms. The US government is calling for a 2-state solution and have continued to send aid to Palestine, much of which has not made it to Gaza due to Israel blockades and protests. But people are upset about the discrepancies between aid sent to Israel versus Palestine. They're sending humanitarian aid to Palestine, which is great, but they're also sending guns and tanks to Israel, which further disallow entry of aid into the places it's needed. Additionally, as the International Court of Justice recently brought forth a ruling that ordered Israel to stop its offense on Rafah, a city in Palestine, and the further investigation of genocidal acts done by Israel, Joe Biden made a statement opposing the ruling, saying contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide. The US government may favor Israel, but what about the citizens? Statistics show a mixture of support for Palestine and Israel. A study from March showing that Americans are divided on the ways in which Israel has carried out its attack on Hamas. Although the opinions are mixed, there is a slight lean towards support for Israel. It was also shown that young adults are more likely to align themselves with Palestine, while older generations are more likely to find themselves aligning with Israel. I find this most visible in the many student-led protests around the US. At over 130 universities in the United States, thousands of students and people have joined together in protest, rallies, and encampments, calling for the divestment of universities from academic relationships with Israeli institutions, as well as the freeing of Palestine. These encampments and protests have been met with brutal violence from police, decked out in riot gear. More than 2,000 protesters have been arrested, including students, professors, and supporters unaffiliated with the universities. The student protests don't even account for the hundreds of other protests being held all over, with calls for boycotts, government withdrawal from Israel aid, accountability from the government for complacency and the brutality, and the freedom of Palestine being shouted loudly and proudly. Similarly to the US, Canada has traded with Israel for years. The original Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement coming into effect in 1997, and the two-way trade reaching $1.7 billion in 2017. Although Israel isn't one of Canada's top trading partners, exports were $315 million in 2023. In terms of government perspectives on the conflict, Justin Trudeau posted a tweet following the October 7th attack, which stated, "Canada strongly condemns the current terrorist attack against Israel. These acts of violence are completely unacceptable. We stand with Israel and fully support its right to defend itself. Our thoughts are with everyone affected by this. Civilian life must be protected." Since this initial statement, Canada's stance has backtracked into a middle ground, calling for the safety of hostages and civilians on both sides. Canada has provided relief to Gaza, but much of the aid provided has been stopped from entering due to Israeli blockades. Canada has started a program set to accept 1,000 Palestinian refugees in Canada. This has faced massive criticism as comparisons to the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel Enactment, or CUEAT, arise. The CUAET program was deemed wildly successful, over 210,000 Ukrainian refugees arriving in Canada, and another 726,000 being approved to stay for up to 3 years, many of which are able to become permanent residents if they wish to. It's understandable people would be so upset at this, with over 1 million people in Rafah as of now, thousands of which are in need of immediate relief. The program for Gaza is restricted only to peoples who have Canadian family members, and yet, despite the apparent leaning towards Israel that the Canadian government has seemed to take, abstaining from votes, continuing to trade with Israel, etc., Justin Trudeau addressed the ICJ's ruling by saying that Israel must follow it and end its offense on Rafah. The people of Canada are neutral on this situation, according to the Angus Reid Institute. Towards the beginning of the conflict, a majority of people leant towards Israel's sides, but now a number of Canadians express their sympathies to both sides. Although Canada is not meeting the news for protests and encampments nearly as much as the US, they are still happening. McGill University, the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, the University of Ottawa, and so many others have had and currently have encampments. This isn't to mention the protests happening from the west coast to the east, and the protests are happening. In Fredericton, protests and workshops and education panels have been happening since October 7th. There's multiple organizations that have existed for years trying to educate people on Palestine and Israel. And one of these organizations that I hope to cover more is the Fredericton Palestine Solidarity Movement. FPS is an organization that was founded in 2008 and currently has over 17 organizers. Thankfully, I got in touch with 2 of the people who work closely with the movement, and over the course of 2 interviews, I learned a lot about what the movement does, their perspectives on everything, their takes on activism, and what people can do to help. Let's listen to Leila and Nomaan.
So my name is Leila. I am Palestinian.
I'm Nomaan. I have been in Canada for over 2 years now.
My mom and my dad's side come from the same city, which is right next to Gaza, but now it has been completely ethnically cleansed, and it's now in the occupied territories. My dad's side of the family fled to Gaza, and then my mom's side of the family fled to Jericho, which is on the borders with Jordan, but they were still in Palestine in the 1948, and then 1967. My dad's side fled out of Gaza because of the war that happened in 1967. Actually, my grandfather left for school, but then like soon after that, the war happened again, and my dad's side fled outside of Gaza to Egypt and then to Jordan, and my mom's side fled out of Jericho into Jordan. So most of my family are in Jordan. My grandfather traveled a lot, and we ended up staying in the United Arab Emirates. So I did grow up in the Middle East. I do hold a Palestinian citizenship, which brings up a lot of difficulties, but also I have a lot of pride holding it because not many Palestinians hold a Palestinian citizenship. And I've been to Palestine twice. So first when I was born to get my passport, and then when I was 16 years old, that was for to get my Israeli ID separated from my dad's ID. Very complicated stuff, especially when you're Palestinian. They make it so hard for you.
So I have been involved in things like since 2008, but I used to live in India back then, and there were little movements, protests, stuff like that going on. So I've been aware of the situation. Most recently, I actually have a couple of friends. One of them is Palestinian, one of them is from Lebanon. And when October 7th happened, these guys wanted to get something started in Fredericton.
So FPS is a very diverse group. So we have people of different religious backgrounds, different gender identities, we come from different parts of the world. So we're not all Palestinian. It's Palestinian and Palestinian allies. And I think the Palestinian allies are way more than the Palestinian, which is beautiful to see. And I think every group of people have their thing. Some people have more expertise of going and speaking to politicians. So they set meetings and they go speak to politicians. They speak about our movement. We have a group of people that are great at writing statements. So we have a social media team. We are a fairly large group that are taking care of different forms of activism.
So the organization itself is not very centralized, meaning that there's no hierarchical structure in the organization. There's a bunch of organizers, about, I would say, 15 people. The roles are very flexible, depending on, who has the bandwidth, who's available to do what. So when we put up, for example, different events, different people take charge depending on whoever is available.
I think mid-October, after a couple protests that they've had, I knew that organization was there. I tried to do activism by myself back in 2021, and it was not easy at all. I think that activism needs a strong community. It needs a strong group of people to actually feel comfortable doing it. And so I decided to join FPS and see how it was. And the reason I joined FPS, my goal was to bring in the Palestinian art because I see art as a form of resistance. And that's when we planned the art night in January. But then later on, I found myself loving the other parts of activism, such as, doing the visuals and the protests, and I see the power in those as well. So yeah, I joined FPS to basically advocate for the rights of my people because I do realize that the privilege I have, though I'm Palestinian, but I have more privilege than the Palestinians that live in the West Bank and in Gaza. So I kind of wanted to use that little privilege that I have to advocate for them.
Involved in different aspects of things, from creating material to being involved in specific events to talking to counselors, to meeting Jenica Atwin, there's different things going on. There was a radio show with the campus radio at UNB. So I was involved with setting that up. We also had a little camp at UNB Fredericton, which has been happening every Wednesday for the last 3 weeks. So have been involved in that.
So I moved here to Fredericton 5 years ago. I used to live I used to live in the UAE, and when I came here, the minute I would tell people I'm Palestinian, they would like kind of look confused and tell me Pakistan. There is that group of people that would never know where I'm from, so I had to explain in geography where my country is located. And then the other part of people are pretty much strong believers that Israel should exist, and they saw that from a religious perspective, or they saw that from a political perspective that Israel should exist. So moving here, it was not easy. And as a Palestinian, I wouldn't say ashamed, but I was scared of like proudly saying that I'm Palestinian at some point moving here. It's a different culture, different country, different people, something I've never been exposed to. And I could see the dehumanizing in people when I tell them I'm Palestinian. Like I can tell they dehumanize us from the way they would speak to me, from the way they would ask their questions, and so on. So the change, if I want to say the change that I hope to, and I'm starting to see, which is for more than just their pain, for more than just their Israel or their terrorists, or they are, there's always conflict in the Middle East, and just, someone from the Middle East. I want people to know us for our uniqueness. And I think people are starting to see this, are starting to see the patience, the resilience, the strength of the Palestinians. They're starting to actually enjoy our culture, enjoy our heritage, believe in us, and hear us and speak for us. So within Fredericton, I think now when I say I'm Palestinian, people cannot hide. You know, they either right away, whether like, solidarity, or they tell me, yeah, I know where Palestine is, or I don't even have to explain where Palestine is anymore. And I'm seeing that a lot, especially with the workshop that I had today. Like, nobody ever questioned where Palestine was. Everybody just knew where it was, which is beautiful. My hopes for Palestine is, I have a belief that Palestine will be free, and every Palestinian has a strong belief. And this is what my grandparents taught me. This is what my parents taught me. This is what I'll teach to my future kids, is that we know that Palestine will be free. But I have, my belief now grew bigger and stronger that it will be sooner than later. And I have a belief that I will see Palestine free.
So there's multiple things that we hope to achieve. One of them is more long-term, which is educational. There's still a lot of perception that this is a complicated issue, and that, there's both sides of the coin and self-defense and all this kind of stuff. And people, even now, 7, 8 months down the line, are still talking about, what about Hamas? What about this? What about that? And I think the educational aspect of it is just to talk about the historical context for the situation, and to talk about Israeli apartheid, to talk about the occupation in the historical context. It's a colonial issue, it's a land grab issue, not so different from the colonial situation in Canada, but just more contemporary. But there are also like short-term aims, which is more about just ceasefire, for example, putting pressure on local leaders, federal leaders, provincial leaders.
I think that one of the beautiful things that we have as, when we're younger, is our curiosity and wanting to know. So I think not just for Palestine, but generally be more open to diversity and be more open to knowing each other. This is something I had to learn here in Canada. And I think it's beautiful because it made me form a beautiful community, made me be able to join other beautiful communities. And I think that students, and I see that more in the Gen Z than the other generations. I think Gen Zs are more like exposed to diversity through our social media. So I think students should take the time to read and learn, read about Palestine as much as they can. Yeah, I would take it step by step, and I think that students should take the time to do their own learning. Just take the time to learn and read and take it slow. Because I am Palestinian, but I didn't have much information about Palestine when I was in school. I just knew that Palestine was colonized and that's it, and free Palestine, and Palestine is my land, though I am Palestinian. I did much more learning when I started my activism with FPS, and a little bit before that as well.
I think it's important to get involved locally in your communities. And, like this is something that's international. So the first instinct might be to say, oh, what can I do about that? I'm not going to stop anyone from bombing. But I think we've seen in the last few months how local movements and people power can really push certain things. The other thing is, if you're working on, let's say, some climate related stuff or some queer rights related stuff or housing related stuff, whatever your interest is, I think it's really helpful to build alliances and make those connections, because at the end of the day, we are fighting similar oppressive structures. So, for example, in this case, there's a war machine that we're fighting, which is deeply tied to big arms companies, fossil fuel companies, things like this. And at the end of the day, the politicians are not making the decisions that they should make because of the money that's flowing into these companies. And so it's important to make those connections and stand with each other in solidarity. So, whatever your cause is, whatever you are passionate about, it's important to recognize that when you stand in solidarity with Gaza, you also advance that building of those communities, those alliances. And eventually that's what's gonna take things forward. Because in this moment, this is the big issue, but building those alliances in the long run will mean that we can, at the end of the day, come together for various issues and then push more people power in the future.
Nomaan and Leila, both different activists from different walks of life, both holding different perspectives and opinions and connections to the conflict, yet both of them said the same thing. When I asked what can we do, they said, educate yourselves. There are a million ways to help, of course. There's the Olive Branch Project on social media, which allows you to connect with a family in Palestine and share their story, as well as rally for assistance for them in the form of donations and awareness. There's over 800 GoFundMes from people trying to escape Palestine, seeing as the current fee to escape is $5,000 per adult and $2,500 to $3,000 per child. There's the matter of attending protests and rallies, spreading awareness while also asking for change. There's the BDS Movement, a movement that calls for the boycotting, divestment, and economic sanctions from Israel and Israeli partnered institutions. The list of corporations is on their website. You can listen to music by Palestinian artists and artists who are in support of Palestine, a popular example being Macklemore, who is giving all money made from his song Hinds to Palestine. You can give speeches and make videos and write poems and create paintings. You should do all of these things, especially follow the BDS guidelines and donate. But the most important thing that you or anyone else can do is to educate yourself. You may think, you don't share a connection to Palestine, you don't have any relatives or friends from there, but you do. You do have a connection to Palestine. We're all human beings. That connection is powerful and life-changing. So do research, watch videos, connect with Palestinians, talk with friends and family about what's going on there, gain different perspectives, learn, and don't stop learning. This might be your first introduction to Palestine and Israel and everything going on there, but it shouldn't be your last. I am not Palestinian, and I am only here in an attempt to uplift Palestinian voices and tell you what they've been saying for months, for years. Learn about their stories, their lives, their cultures, their identities. The goal that so many of these people in Palestine seek is not only for the freedom of Palestine from Israel, but the freedom of Palestinians from the Israeli narrative. I hope that this documentary or this video essay, whatever this has turned out to be, has been of some assistance in helping you take those first few steps into the world of activism or education, or I hope that if you already knew about all of this, that you enjoyed listening. My real end goal with this entire documentary is really just to try and encourage you to learn more, to care about the world and the people in it, because you may think what I'm doing doesn't matter. Where I go out to eat, what I do, what I say, what I post on social media. I mean, I can't help people from just posting. I don't have any power. I'm just a normal person. I want you to know that that is the most untrue thing I've ever heard. So listen to Nomaan and Leila and listen to all of the Palestinians who are asking for help and keep all eyes on Rafah. Thank you.
Leve Palestina och krossa sionismen. Leve Palestina och krossa sionismen.